All right,
All right, you can get started whenever you're ready.
of course. Hello, I'm Cici from Cornerstone Christian Academy, and my project is Chinatown Story. Vancouver's Chinatown is my topic, and it tells the story of how Chinatown within a century has transformed from a small, risky settlement to an attractive tourist destination and finally a preserved historical site. And despite its meager beginnings, how it has still made a lasting contribution to Canada, and that concludes its significance. Vancouver's Chinatown is located in downtown Vancouver and takes up 6 commercial blocks. It is one of Canada's largest and oldest Chinese settlements. The Chinese first came to British Columbia in 1886, and like many other immigrant groups, they came in search of new economic opportunities, the Fraser River Gold Rush. However, when it didn't provide the wealth the Chinese and many others had hoped it would, the Chinese decided to settle in Vancouver permanently. After the Fraser River Gold Rush, the Chinese went to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway. This difficult and dangerous work united Eastern and Western Canada as a nation, allowing for more efficient trade and travel between the provinces. These two waves of immigration, one sparked by the Fraser River Gold Rush and the other by the Canadian Pacific Railway, led the Chinese to gather on Vancouver Island, forming the first Canadian Chinatown. From the 1890s to about the 1930s, over 1,000 Chinese residents were already living in Chinatown. And during this period of expansion, the Chinese experienced many hardships. And with few resources, it was difficult to adapt to the new environment, especially when discrimination and exclusion were common. Moreover, they were targeted by European Canadian businessmen who wanted to control the market and the anti-Asian activists who, in particular, the Anti-Asian Alliance, regularly attacked Chinese homes and commercial buildings. Still, the Chinese had kept pressing on. They continued making new homes, new shops, and continued practicing their culture in the new environment. And in time, they began mixing Eastern and Western architectural styles, creating something distinctly Chinese and Canadian. Canada was meeting China, and China was meeting Canada. In the middle of the 20th century, Chinatown went through a process called beautification. The goal was to make Chinatown an attractive tourist destination for non-Chinese people to come and visit. The project was successful, and curious Canadians now came in large numbers to browse shops filled with porcelain teapots, chopsticks, slippers, and other traditional Chinese items. The experience of interacting with the Chinese people and their culture helped create stronger bonds between British Columbia and the Chinese Canadians. In 1971, the federal government announced a policy of multiculturalism, which recognized the need to maintain the cultural heritage of all groups within a multicultural population. This policy led to the national recognition of Chinatown as a historical site of symbolic significance to all Canadians, and the local recognition of Chinatown as a historic community by the city of Vancouver. Then this meant that Chinatown was to be maintained and preserved. And all Canadians of all backgrounds were encouraged to come and visit Chinatown, not just for commercial tourism, but to also learn about its history. Throughout its history, Chinatown has undergone many transformations. Starting as a small, risky settlement, it blossomed into an expansive magnet for new Chinese immigrants, was transformed into an attractive tourist destination, and finally, a preserved historical site. Despite its meager beginnings and many hardships, Chinatown has made a lasting contribution to Canada, and that is why its light shines so bright. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Great presentation, Cece. I have a few questions for you. So first of all, you did touch upon this, but why is it important for people to understand the history of Vancouver's Chinatown?
It's because the Chinese Canadians came here in 1886, and not just because for the Fraser River Gold Rush, because after that they were in search of new jobs, and then that's when the CPR was supposed to be made. So then they helped contribute to making this, and there was a saying that's like each mile, a Chinese Canadian died during the creation of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And we should care about this because despite the discrimination and their poverty back then, with their not really developed Chinatown, it was still really difficult for them to progress this much. And they also contributed to a very historical object that's very honored and is still in use today. And it's the Canadian Pacific Railway.
Absolutely. And in the context of, today's society and everything that's going on recently, what can we learn from devastating historical events like the ones that you mentioned on anti-Asian hate and violence?
Well, we can learn that sometimes it isn't really they're doing it on purpose. It's sometimes it's the cause of events that happen with specific groups at a certain time. Because, for example, the Chinese first came to British Columbia, and they were in search of new jobs again. But then they worked for lower wages compared to the Canadians that were already there. So the Canadians didn't want any competition in jobs, and the businessmen had a better impression of the Chinese Canadians since they were willing to work, and two, they worked for lower wages. So they hired the Chinese Canadians more. And so the Canadians, seeing that they were still in poverty and they're really underdeveloped, they didn't really like the fact that they were coming here and intruding and stealing their job opportunities. So then they just wanted to push the Chinese Canadians back to Chinatown and further and back to China.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, right? But what would you say we can do better in terms of acceptance and celebration of different cultures in local communities?
I would say we should learn to preserve every culture's legacy and diversity, because that's really important since it makes up our country. Since Canada is a diverse and multicultural country, and it's often referred to as the peace country. Because of this, I believe that we should not only learn to accept all groups, and we should first, we should learn to get a stable knowledge of this culture and group of people and what their traditions are and their religion that they believe in before we just choose to discriminate against them and try to push them away. Because most people, all humans, even if they don't like to admit it, we like sameness. We aren't really used to differences, and we need to learn to adapt to them and be flexible to this kind of adaptation, because there will always be more cultures that are going to come in and that are going to be formed, and we need to prepare for that.
Absolutely. So kind of related to that, how important is the multiculturalism policy that you mentioned in terms of the acceptance and recognition of different communities like that of Chinese Canadians?
It's actually really important, because without it, Chinatown wouldn't have been going through that much beautification, even if it still was before the policy was announced. And it also acknowledged Chinatown's story and just put it out there as published in the publicity, and to show that this is a story that you should all learn about. And it acknowledged Chinatown's significance.
Absolutely. And I cannot end this interview without asking about your poster board because it looks amazing. What was the process behind everything that you've made there?
Of course. So a lot of people, when they first come and see my project, they have thought about how it was made, and what goes through their head is oh, this is so complicated. How did you make it? But the process surely isn't simple, but it isn't that complicated in the first place. And it's the Millennium Gate. So first, for this part, I used gift wrapping rolls, which is this, and they fitted perfectly. So I took the wrapping paper out and then I painted it so that it would match the colors of the white pillars in Chinatown. And then the designs here were printed out from a Chinese website that included artists that drew the design patterns about Chinese architecture, and I just found it. And back then in 2019, I really liked it. So then I brought it back to Canada. And then when I was going to do this project, I just flipped through the number of designs and I found this one that was awfully similar to Chinatown's design of the Millennium Gate. So I printed that out again, and then I glued it onto my Chinatown board, headboard. But before all of this, I have to make the base so that I would know the measurements of my Millennium Gate and how it's going to be made, because without it, I wouldn't get the proportions right, because it also has to match with my words in my title board. And it also needed connecting points because then it would topple over. So I got these, which is made by, originally it's a foam board that was like this. There wasn't a hole in there. So I put this on top of it and then I drew the line and then I cut it out so that it would link to each other and it would be supported. And finally, most of my headboard is made with cardboard, foam board, and wood, because my whole project is actually really recyclable in the first place. So it's really just paint, cardboard, foam board, and wood. That's pretty much it, because this is popsicle sticks, and these are foam board, and the rest of my board is also foam board.
Wow. Well, that looks like it required a lot of effort. And even though it may be recyclable, I think you should keep this project forever and ever, because it's so amazing. And congratulations on everything. And that does conclude our interview. So great work.
Thank you.